Hello and welcome back to Vocation. My name is Matty, and today I'm very pleased to announce I'm joined by another great guest. The great Ralph Ellis has joined us today. We're very appreciative of his time for coming over, but I think it's going to be a real journey for people to understand and learn a little bit more about Ralph's work and his background with it too. Even just to do a quick little introduction, can you tell us a little bit, Ralph, about your area of study and expertise and sort of how you got into it a little bit, if that's all right?
Yeah, I've been studying revisionary theology for ever since I was 14, really. I think I wrote my first few pages on this subject. So we're talking 50 years ago now. Written 14 books, I think. I've lost count anyway. I've written a number of books on this topic ever since. The first book wasn't written until 97, I think. So we're still talking 28 years ago.
Wow.
And been studying ever since. And you'll note I'm called here Pope Ralph Ellis.
Brilliant.
That's just my preferred pronoun. You know, sometimes I'm Your Majesty, sometimes I'm the Pope. You know. So yeah, this has been a lifelong study. It's just an interest of mine that's turned into a sort of profession. I've had professions outside this, of course. I was in surveying, I was a computer analyst, I was an airline pilot, you know, all sorts of things. Truck driver, you name it, I've done it. So a bit of a polymath, really. And I know the subject fairly well. I've debated with the more professional, you might say, the more well-known characters in this field, and the theories I've got have stood the test of time. Nobody has been able to falsify them so far. I've had a good conversation with Grok recently. In fact, just a couple of days ago, so we'll talk about that. And Grok was angry, you might say. I didn't know Grok could become angry, but there we go.
Yeah, become with sentient a wee bit.
Yeah, Grok used to be much more amenable before. When it was Grok 3, it was happily looking at alternative ideas and was incorporating them. But Grok 4 seems to be very antagonistic. It wants to maintain the classical agenda, and that's about all it will listen to. So that was a bit strange.
That's interesting, yeah. And maybe even just to give people, I remember learn about how cinema and or TV works. They always talk about the hook to get the audience sort of into this sort of kind of work. And you must have one of the biggest hooks there is out there, really, with it regarding your work. 'Cause you've made one of the most extraordinary discoveries when I first heard it, when I came across your work initially. Can you give us the big reveal, maybe to start off, and then we'll get into the beginning of this?
Which one? I've probably got about 20 hooks, I think. Depending on whether we're talking Old Testament or New Testament. I mean, I found Jesus in the historical record, so that's always a good one. John the Baptist, I found him in the historical record. All of these characters, this is always the problem with history, and the reason why I got involved in this in the first place is that none of these people can be found in the historical record. So I was the lone atheist when I was at school. And because I went to a C of E school, Church of England. And so everyone was saying when I was a youngster, well, why don't you believe? And so I was the only one who actually read the texts to find out why I didn't believe. So they all believed, but never read anything. And I didn't believe, and I read everything. And I found that what was being preached from the pulpit was not exactly what it said in the texts. And then the other thing that I found was that all of these characters are missing from the historical record. And that's unusual. You've got a very good history of ancient Egypt and ancient Judea. And a lot of that is verifiable history. You know, just the general outline, the general story can be verified as being historical. And yet all of the characters are missing. And that's odd. Why are they missing? You know, whether it's all the way back from Abraham and Jacob, all the way through to King David and Solomon, all the way through to Jesus and John the Baptist and everyone else. They're all missing from the historical record. And I suppose you've got two choices there, haven't you? You've got the maximalists who will say, well, it's in the Bible, therefore believe it, no evidence required. Or the minimalists who say, well, we can't find these people, therefore it's all fiction. And I didn't really believe either of those two options, so I adopted a middle path, which is, I think these people are in history, but they've been misidentified. And normally misidentified by slightly moving the chronology. Because if you move the chronology, then you cannot find these characters in the era you're looking at. With the New Testament, I think there is a 40-year chronological chasm, as I say, between the classical history of the New Testament and where I think that history actually lies. And in the Old Testament, there's about a 350-year chronological chasm between where the Exodus is claimed, which is normally about 1200, and where it actually should be, which is like 1570 odd BC. So you've got this 370-year gap. And so anyone looking into the 13th century, late 13th century, for the Exodus event is not going to find it because it's not there. And that's what you'll find if you read any of the favorite historians like Silberman and Finkelstein and so on. They will say there is no evidence for the Exodus. Well, yeah, fine, because you're looking in the 13th century, you're not going to find it. And so I've had a few discussions with Finkelstein, and he's not on board because this becomes political. It becomes modern political. Because the true, and we'll go through this in a minute, the true history of the Exodus means that the Israelites are not quite who they say they are, and they didn't go quite where they said they went, sort of thing. So it becomes modern political because this is still current. The conflict is still ongoing. They're still fighting in Gaza. Nothing has really changed. So this is pertinent to the modern era. It's not just mere history. The old adage, if you don't learn from history, you're condemned to repeat the same mistakes. And you can see those same animosity and the same battles still going on even today. So, yeah, that's what we're going to talk about.
Yeah. I was even chatting to somebody else this morning, and I was sort of just having this discussion about like the importance of studying this subject. And it's sort of pertinent to sort of the time of the year. It's coming up to 2026, the end of the calendar year. And go, why is it even 2026? Where do we start this counting from? Because it's just seeped through into everything. So many people in sort of the modern world, especially in my generation, you sort of think of anything that happens before the year 2000 as irrelevant almost. They're so sort of atheistic with it. They go, well, what's the point of studying the Bible? What's the sort of point of studying ancient history a little bit with it? Or they think of Christianity as a bit of just woo-woo. But it's so seeped through all of our different institutions and our way of life and our way of thinking, and it's totally molded sort of the psyche of sort of Western civilization the last couple of thousand years.
Even that is not as claimed, of course. I mean, that just, that one little thing that you're talking about. We are not in 2025 following the birth of Jesus. We are in 2025 of the great month of Pisces. And so it's astrological. The reason why we're in 2025 is astrological. I suppose actually you call it astronomical because this is a real event. This is the precession of the equinox, which pervades all of these stories. We will come across this when we're talking about the Exodus. The great month of Aries, the shepherds, ran from 1750 BC all the way through to AD 10, AD 5 maybe, depending on where you draw the line between the two constellations. And so it was coincidental that Jesus was born at that time, but the real date they were looking at was the change between Aries and Pisces. So the great month of Pisces started in about AD 5. And that's why Jesus was born as a Lamb of God under Aries, but became a fisher of men under Pisces. So we are 2025, great month of Pisces, and when we stand at what did they call it, the dawn of the age of Aquarius, as the famous song goes from the 1970s, I think that was. But they were a little bit premature, actually. My reckoning is we don't get to Aquarius until about 2300, because the average great month is supposed to be 2,200 years old, but this one, Pisces, is a bit longer. It's a bit bigger than the other constellations, and so we should run through to about 2300 or 2350.
And even just to set up the conversation a little bit more, I sort of like taking a step back and doing a macro view of things, just to sort of come into the topic to give it sort of the relevance. Astro-Theology is a theme throughout sort of your work and throughout sort of what's going on into the Bible and about ancient religion. Can you give people a little bit of an overview about the importance of Astro-Theology? We've touched on it a bit today, but how meaningful was it to the sort of
It was the foundation for all of these ancient religions, whether you're talking Mesopotamia or Egypt, and probably over in South America. I've not really studied that area so much, but they were all astro-theological. They were Sabaeans. Saba, hence the Queen of Saba, the Queen of Sheba. Saba in Egyptian means star. And so she was the Queen of the stars, the Queen of the heaven. Which is, we'll come across this in the Old Testament, that, the Jews used to worship the Queen of Heaven. So they were Sabaeans, they were astronomers, and therefore they wanted a astronomical observatory from which to make their studies of the heavens. And in Central America and so on, they made their pyramids, which you could stand on the top of, above the... if you've ever been to Central America, you stand above all of the forest below you, and you can observe the stars. And same in Egypt, you can stand on top of the Great Pyramid because it always had a platform on the top, and you can observe the stars. And so they were astronomers. The Mandeans say this about John the Baptist. John the Baptist was a Sabaean, an astronomer. And he used to only observe at night, of course. That was his profession. And then he got married, and he was most upset that his wife was getting angry because he was always up at night doing his observations. And so they finally allowed him to observe the heavens 4 nights a week, and he was allowed 3 nights to be with his wife. And so, John the Baptist was a Sabaean priest and priest and prince, and he came from Edessa, but we'll look at that in another talk because that's another topic. But all of these ancient religions were all observing the stars, and all of the characters that we see were incarnations of the heavens above. Hence the Queen of Sheba is the Queen of the stars. She was an incarnation of the heavens above. She was an incarnation of Isis. All of the pharaohs were sons of a god, sons of Ra, sons of the moon, Yah. Yahweh means the moon in Egyptian. We'll come across this. We'll look at the hieroglyphs in a minute. So all of the pharaohs and the important aristocrats of Egypt were incarnations of some sort of cosmic deity. And as above, so below, we get the same on earth as in the heavens above. So to study what's going to happen on earth, you must look at the heavens above. So the zodiac, and we'll look at the zodiacs maybe in the next talk, I don't know, we'll see. But anyway, the central symbol of Judaism used to be the zodiac, all the way through into the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century AD. All of the synagogues had a zodiac on the floor because it was the most important symbolism within Judaism. So that is astro-theology, and it permeates all of these religions all the way through until when did it disappear? It was sort of about the first millennium AD that astrology became sort of taboo within Christianity, and it was suppressed and it was sidelined, and they sort of dropped most of the astro-theology within Christianity and obviously within Islam. But Islam is Sabaean as well, that they are just recreating the heavens. We'll look at that in another talk, perhaps. But overtly, you would not know that because they've dropped it from their theology. And so we no longer know that most religions are simply astronomy and astrology.
Oh, yeah. It's something we'll get deeply into this talk with it for sure. And I think I have a talk with Michael coming up on Astro-Theology next, so this will weave together perfectly with it. And when you speak about things like Islam, you see like the crescent moon and you see the star. And so you know them by their symbols is a phrase I quite like. And yes. we'll definitely get into the sort of the root of Christianity and sort of how it's kind of like a kind of sun worship that's sort of been repackaged maybe in a little bit as a way too. But when we're speaking about these ancient religions, again, we talk about Christianity, we then think about Islam, we think about Judaism then also. And this ties us right back to the beginning of the story about how, of the Exodus. And so this was how the Jews then left Egypt at the time. Can you sort of tie up again, just a bit of the macro picture, what actually happened then at sort of the start of this Judaism? These were people that were present in Egypt, I guess, and they were these sort of astrology, sort of star worshippers, these kind of things. Can you sort of just paint that background a little bit for people, and we'll walk through that?
Yeah, this is the argument I was having with Grok just a couple of days ago, that it's been my assertion ever since 1995 that the Israelite Exodus is the Hyksos Exodus out of Egypt. Because we have this strange oddity that this great event, which is central to Judaism, cannot be found in the historical record. You know, all of the historians and theologians have looked at the evidence, the historical evidence, and none of this can be found in the historical record. And I don't know what the problem is here, why they are so blind to the obvious. But we have an Exodus, a well-known historical Exodus. It's known as the Hyksos, or in America, they call them the Hyksos Exodus. And Josephus gives both pronunciations, so they're both correct. Anyway, I tend to use Hyksos. How many times out of Egypt do we have a mass exodus of hundreds of thousands of people? You know, that's the story. The story of the Exodus is hundreds of thousands of people getting thrown out, having a war with the Egyptians, and getting thrown out of Egypt and going to Jerusalem. Well, yes, but that's exactly what the Hyksos did. They had a war with the Egyptians, a civil war, as it were, and they got thrown out of Egypt and they went to Jerusalem. How many times would that happen in ancient history? Not very often, I would say. There's good reason to look at the Hyksos Exodus and see whether there are any similarities. And I would say there are quite a few. And so we might as well look at those now. So what I will do is I will go on to screen share.
Yeah, no worries. And just as you're calling it up there, just to sort of set it up a little bit, and when we're looking at sort of history with it, history of the Jews as well, we're talking about ancient Egypt, the Bible, again, consisting of 66 books in the Protestant one, over 70, I think, in the Catholic. You have Genesis at the beginning, and then the very next story is this of Exodus, which is of the Jews being thrown out of Egypt. This is the whole story of Moses crossing the sea, starting their own sort of journey in their new land then. And so, yeah, feel free to take it away. What are we looking at here?
Well, this is a direct correlation with ancient Egypt, of course. This was in the era of Jacob, the patriarch Jacob, who we all know about from the Old Testament. But there was a Pharaoh, of course, called Jacob, Pharaoh Jacob of the Hyksos dynasty. So we're talking sort of here about 1650, 1700 BC. And just before the 18th dynasty came along. And we have a Hyksos pharaoh called Jacob. So this is his cartouche. And you read from the curved end over here on the left. And we have the reed glyph, which it's often said to be ah, but it's more of an eh. And if you get two of them together, it's more of an e. Then the bowl here is K. The boot is a B, or the foot. And the arm is an A. So we get Jacob, which is the name for Jacob. And then the determinative at the end is something to do with water, something to do with the sea. So we have Pharaoh Jacob. This is a pharaoh of Egypt called Jacob, just as we have in the biblical text. Now, dear old Grocky said, oh, well, yes, that's just a common name, and therefore there's no correlation at all. Well, yeah, it's not actually that common. There are two pharaohs called Jacob within the Hyksos dynasty. So it's not super common, but it is a direct correlation.
Where is this hieroglyph from? Sorry.
It's just, the best, if people are looking for this, is, well, it doesn't really have a title. Just a minute, because there we go. This book here, which doesn't have a title on the front, so I've got to open it up, and it's called Chronicle of the Pharaohs. This is one of the best just general guides. It's not a historical textbook as such. And if you want to study the pharaohs of Egypt, it goes through all of the dynasties, and it gives all of the names and the hieroglyphs of all of the pharaohs. So it's quite a good general guide, that one. As you can see, mine is well thumbed.
Very good.
It's got no back on it anymore.
And so, yeah, we're I sort of just want to maybe even bring in new viewers along this sort of journey along with this. So forgive me if I'm asking quite simple questions just initially as we build up upon it. But yeah, we're saying this story of the Exodus, this story in the Bible, it's not just sort of mythological tale as we went over originally. This is linked to a real event that happened in ancient Egypt. And you're looking through the historical record and you're saying this was the time of the Hyksos. These were the people that were expelled from Egypt. Can you give us a little bit of detail and then about who the Hyksos really were? You're saying they were related to Jacob then, this is
yeah,
right?
Well, these are the Hyksos. This is their name in the Egyptian. And so we have Hyk on the left here, starting on the left, with the shepherd's crook, because these people were known as the shepherd kings. Now, if you look in a modern textbook, they will say they were kings of the mountains or foreign kings. But that's a modern interpretation. Josephus Flavius, who came from an era when people still spoke Egyptian, said that the name meant the shepherd kings. And of course, the name starts with a shepherd's crook. So Hyk, this triangular is a K, and the bird is an A. So it's Hyka. And then the sieve here is a K. This bird again is an A. This is supposed to be a bolt, like a door bolt, is an S. And then the bun is a T. And then this determinative is something to do with hills or mountains or foreign lands. So we get Hykasut. And the Greeks, they pronounced that as Hyksos. They bastardized a lot of these words into Greek. So they turned Hykakasut into Hyksos. And these were a group of people who came down into Egypt. They took over Egypt. They came from Mesopotamia, very, very similar to the sort of Abraham story. And one of the Hyksos pharaohs, of course, was called Mamabra, Abramam. Very, very similar names. They came down from Mesopotamia and they took over the Nile Delta region, so Lower Egypt as it's known, and they became Egyptians. I mean, you really can't tell the difference between the two. They spoke Egyptian, they had Egyptian theology, except they worshipped Set more than Osiris. So they were slightly different, but it was pretty much thoroughly Egyptian. You would not know the difference between them. But obviously they did, because the locals had a civil war with them. So the southern Egyptians started a civil war with the Hyksos. And this war dragged on probably for 20-30 years until they were pushed out on an exodus. But this was an organized exodus. It wasn't just a rout. They weren't chased out of Egypt. It was an agreement to leave, which is pretty much what the Old Testament says about the Israelites. They were not simply just pushed out of Egypt. They came to an agreement, and they had a war with the Egyptians. If you read the King James version, it says they spoiled the Egyptians. Well, the word being used is normally looted. So there was a definite civil war between the two of them. And then they were advised to leave. And we have this from the Ahmose Stela of Ahmose I, which is the era of the Hyksos Exodus. Ahmose was the southern Egyptian pharaoh who chased the northern pharaoh out of Egypt. And the stela they wrote about this is very, very similar to the Exodus story. It talks of storms and darkness for 3 days and all of this sort of business, which we will go through the reason why there was. But it also says that in order to induce the Hyksos to leave, they were given gold and silver and cloth and oil as a tribute, as a bribe, to make them leave Egypt. Well, the Torah says exactly the same about the Israelites, that they were given gold and silver and cloth and oil in order to leave Egypt. And they used that gold and that cloth to build the tabernacle, which was the mobile temple that they took with them.
I see.
The story is very, very much the same. And I think for many reasons it probably was the same. In fact, the biblical story goes into more detail, because it says the oil was oil for cooking and oil for lamps. And they took so much oil for lamps out of Egypt that the Egyptians had no lamps left in Egypt, and they were left in darkness. So you get the extra detail with the Torah story that you don't get in the historical story. And this, of course, links up with the Exodus description of the 3 days of darkness and so on. That's why they needed the oil for lamps, because they had 3 days of darkness. So why did they have this 3 days of darkness? Well, I think it was because of this. Well, not precisely this, of course, because we don't have pictures of it, but this is a large volcano, and the Israelites had something very similar. And so did the Hyksos, because they had the 3 days of darkness in the Hyksos Exodus as well. So we have these two Exodus events, which have very, very similar descriptions and backgrounds. We've already looked at the leader called Jacob. They were both circumcised people as well. The Egyptians were circumcised. They both had curly side locks of hair. We know that obviously with the Jewish Israelite hairstyles, but the Egyptians did that as well. The high priests normally had a side lock of hair. They both wore earrings. Now, Jews don't wear earrings now, but they did on the Exodus. But for some reason, I forget the reasoning on this, but after the Exodus, they buried all of their earrings and they never wore earrings again. But during this era, both of these peoples wore earrings. They were both called shepherds. Obviously, the Israelites were known as the patriarchs were known as shepherds. They were supposed to be, sheep herders. But the Hyksos were the shepherd kings. But in a way, they were both kings, because if you look at the description of Abraham, Abraham had 318 army officers. Now, what sort of shepherd has an army with 318 officers? If they were all centurions, then he had an army of 30,000 men. What sort of shepherd has an army with 30,000, a standing army with 30,000 men? Well, that would be the shepherd kings, the Hyksos. Again, Grok got very upset. Grok misquotes quite a lot. You have to be very careful. It will quote things and give you a reference, and when you look that reference up, it's incorrect. It's giving you an incorrect quote. And what it did in this case is it said, no, Josephus never said that. It said that he had servants. Yeah, but that is in a separate paragraph. The first paragraph that Josephus quotes about, because Josephus tells us the whole story of the Exodus. The first quote says that he had army officers. And so you go back to quote and say, back to Grok and say, look, this is what the quote says. And then Grok will say, oh, sorry, I got that wrong. I misremembered. Yeah, thank you, Grok. You're leading us down the garden path again, which it does all the time. It's very, very, it's very poor research, and it's inexplicably giving the wrong data sometimes. It will give you a quote which simply does not exist in the historical record, which is problematic, to say the least.
And when you're looking at the historical record, again, we're speaking about the book of Exodus, and you've mentioned Josephus a few times. Can you give people a bit of an overview who Josephus is? I know this is something we'll get into quite a bit, but who are these main historical sources that you're referencing to first, to then do the comparison to say, okay, all these things are happening in both sides of the story. This is how, this is the evidence why we're saying that the Exodus was a real event. Then what are these other historical sources essentially then, just for people to catch up on?
Yes, we had that argument with Grok again, because if you want to argue with Grok, it'll go on for 2 or 3 days if you want. It'll just
You've been in the ring here with him,
which is quite illuminating sometimes. Sometimes Grok can come up with some extra data that you hadn't seen before. So it has a voluminous memory, of course. It has access to all of these ancient records. It just doesn't always use them properly. But
maybe one day.
Josephus was a 1st century AD historian involved in the Jewish revolt. He was a Jew.
He was the main historian of the 1st century. Then that's correct. So
for that era and that region, he was a Jew who became a Roman and started working for the Romans. And pertinent to this discussion, what happened is that he was working for the Romans after the Jewish revolt and the destruction of Jerusalem. So he was given the scrolls from the temple after the temple was destroyed in AD 70. And those scrolls were the oldest Torahs, because we don't have very old Torahs. Most of the Torahs today only stem from about 1,000 years ago. Josephus got the Torah from the time of Xerxes during the Babylonian exile. So he had the oldest Torah that we know of. And from that, he wrote his own version of the Old Testament. So we have 2 documents to use. We have the Old Testament, which is a slightly spiritualized and slightly fantasized version of the history. And then we have the original document, which was by Josephus Flavius, known as Antiquities, and that is supposed to be a real history of. It's not written as a religious document. It's written as history, taken from the Torah that was in the Temple of Jerusalem in AD 70. And I think that is much more authoritative. And it reads as if it is more like history than the Torah does. And so there are differences between the two. And so if you read this passage in the Torah, it will say that Abraham had 318 servants. You can see how they've lessened the impact of this story because they want to make Abraham into a mere shepherd and not into a shepherd king. So they've reduced him down. They do this all the time. They did the same with Jesus, of course.
And why would they do this as well?
Because
why would they want to rewrite the history at the time with it? Yeah,
because the persecution complex is a well-known strategy for keeping people together. If you want a group of people to remain faithful to the group, you say that we are the oppressed. We're being oppressed by those evil Egyptians. And so you've got to stay together, otherwise those evil Egyptians will come and get us again. And you can see exactly the same happening with Islam today. Islam does it all the same. You know, they will blow you up in a bus bombing or a tube bombing, and then say, "Oh, it was because we're oppressed." They do it all the time, and it's a well-known tactic to keep people together. We are the oppressed. You know, just listen to them in Gaza or whatever. Well, the Jews did exactly the same, and the Christians did the same with their Jesus, of course. But within Judaism, they like to say we were the oppressed. We were slaves. They weren't really slaves in Egypt. We'll go through this. We were slaves in Egypt. We were oppressed by these horrible Egyptians. Therefore, we have to stay together as a group. That's the only way we're going to survive. And the history of Judaism didn't quite accord with their new strategy. And so they had to reduce their patriarchs down from being pharaohs down to mere shepherds. So they are no longer shepherd kings, they are pastoral shepherds. And it's a strategy that's worked. But if you read through the Old Testament, it's quite clear what they were actually talking about. The text is still the same. It's the interpretation that has changed. And this is one of the areas where, that text has changed. So yeah, that's the reason that I'm using Josephus Flavius as the main source, because I think his version of this story, do I have a copy here? I think it's downstairs because I was using it yesterday. But I tend to use the William Whiston copy. It was the first one that was translated into English. This was back in the Whiston, 1600s. Translated the whole of Josephus into English, which was really good. And so everybody has known about these connections because every manor house, every lord would have had two main books on their library shelf. One would be the Bible, including the Old Testament, and the other one next door to it would be the works of Josephus, because you cannot understand the Old Testament or the New Testament without having the works of Josephus next to you. And that was translated back in the 1600s. So everybody has known about this. And so they've all looked at it and turned a blind eye to it because they don't want to see what it actually tells them, i.e. that there are connections here that they don't like, that, the Israelites are the Hyksos, because that changes the story. Well, I'm always amazed by this because it doesn't change the story at all. Actually, it makes the story real and historical. The only difference is that these pastoral shepherds become real shepherd kings. But that's what the Old Testament says in the first place. It says, the descendants of Abraham will be as numerous as the stars. It says that he had an army of 30,000 men. It's clear that Abraham was more than a pastoral shepherd. He was a shepherd king. He was a Hyksos. And that all that does to the Exodus event is drags it back by 370 years into the past. And so it was 1570 BC instead of about 1200 BC. But there's no evidence for 1200 BC. I mean, even Grok was scrabbling around at this because there is no evidence. Grok was saying, oh, well, they left from Pi Ramesses, which is a Ramesside city in the Delta. Yes, but Pi Ramesses is Avaris, and Avaris was the capital of the Hyksos people. It's the same city. The one was built upon the other. The only difference between the two is 370 years. So again, that's even more evidence that we're talking about the Hyksos Exodus here, not a separate Israelite type Exodus. So yeah, during this Exodus, we have links here. We have historical pegs upon which you can hang this story. And that historical peg is the Santorini eruption. So if we go back to some of these images, the share will be coming up in a minute. There we go. One of the things that happened at this time is there was a pillar of fire and a pillar of smoke. And here it is. Here is the pillar of smoke, and here is the pillar of fire. They're talking about a volcano.
Yeah, yeah.
But of course, there is historically even, there are no volcanoes in Egypt. So what are they talking about? Well, they are talking about Santorini.
Yes.
Santorini is an island, we'll see where it is in a minute, just north of Crete in the Mediterranean, that blew its top in 1600 BC. And so we did have a pillar of fire and a pillar of smoke.
And just if I can just set it up for people a little bit more, again, just coming into this, we're talking about a sort of revision of history in a little way of where the mainstream thought was that it happened at a later date. But what we're looking at here is this happened a few hundred years before. And so again, just for people who are not like Bible scholars, this story of Exodus is of the Jews being thrown out of Egypt. Part of that is being led by Moses. There is this sort of plague that goes on in these horrific events. There's this, the sky goes black for a few days. You have this pillar of smoke, as you're saying, this pillar of fire. And what we're linking those to is the historical events at the time of a volcano, a massive eruption occurring nearby then in the Mediterranean. And these are the events that are being written about and described in sort of more metaphorical language of the time, because they wouldn't know sort of essentially about the ions going off or the photons creating these sort of pillars of fire in the sky. This is all volcanic eruption, and what we're going to go through is all these different details that sort of link the historical sort of evidence with this text of the Exodus. But hopefully that's keeping people along the track with it. Yeah,
absolutely. Well worth explaining, because I tend to expect everyone to know what the Exodus is, but of course a lot of people in the modern world
have no idea.
Not have even heard of it. Because I went to a C of E school. Most schools in Britain now are completely secular. So they don't even have a service in the morning. They don't have Bible readings. They probably never even heard of the Exodus. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm getting old, you see. I'm out of touch with the Gen Zs in this world.
I see. And just one more quick wee point there. When we're talking about why these dates are important, when we're trying to identify who Jesus was exactly, so we have the New Testament, we have the Gospels about who he was, and then we have this other historical record by Josephus Flavius, as you mentioned at the time, who was the first century historian, and that we can see that he wrote about this major revolt that happened in Judea at the time in AD 70. Which led to the destruction of the temple. So the Romans came in, kicked all the Jews out of Judea. He was the guy that ended up getting the main historical documents to write about. And so that's our more objective sort of source. And then when we're looking about his objective source again, about the history of the Jews, this is tying us back to who the Hyksos actually were, the sort of origin of this with it. But this shift in time period is very important, because this is where the obscurity comes. But yes, sorry, please carry on.
And remember that these books have gone through several authors, of course. Josephus was not the original author of this. He is quoting from Manetho. So he not only has his Old Testament, which was taken from the Torah, he has a separate historical work, which is quoting from Manetho, who was an Egyptian historian from 300 BC. So, and Manetho gives the history of the Hyksos Exodus. And so we get that story as well, which we can then mix with the biblical type plague story and link up them together because they are so similar. So this comes from my Jesus Last of the Pharaohs. That was the first book I wrote. And then that was followed up by Tempest and Exodus, which is obviously all about the Exodus and the Tempest Stela of Ahmose I. So these are the books that this come from. And so we had this, this is AI, obviously. AI has some strange oddities to it. So it has this is supposed to be the Santorini Thera eruption. And it puts a sort of modern Spanish galleon in there. Anyway, the ship wouldn't look like that. It would be a trireme or something. But anyway, it gives you an idea that this was the biggest eruption in recorded history. People might have heard of Krakatoa and things of that nature. This was like 10 times the size of Krakatoa.
Right. Yes.
So I wasn't familiar with this. A major, major cataclysm that blew this island apart completely. So this is why it was probably recorded somewhere. This was the biggest event in recorded history. This happened 1600 BC. You would have thought someone might write something about it. And in my works, I say, yes, they did. The Greeks wrote all about it, but they didn't say it was Santorini. If you read the Odyssey, I think they're doing a film on this recently. I'll have to watch it. It seems as though it's going to be a fantasy DEI nonsense, I think, a woke nonsense.
Most things.
As most things are now. But if you read the Odyssey, there are elements in there that sound like the Santorini eruption. Their boat being caught out in a hail of rocks and it's darkness for 3 days and all of that sort of stuff. And then when the skies eventually clear after 3 days, they finally find their way to an island, which is 10 miles away from Santorini. So I think many people did write about this event, but it's been obscured in modern era. We don't realize it. And one of those records is the plagues before the Exodus. These are all the plagues that hit Egypt. So we had the darkness for a number of days. We'll look at that in a minute as well, because we have the pillar of fire and smoke. We have the waters parted by a tsunami. We always have this, because this has been deliberately
my mind.
This has been deliberately obscured, I think, because if you read any texts on this, they'll say, oh, they crossed the Red Sea and the waters were parted. And if they're looking for a scientific explanation, they'll say parted by the wind or something stupid. And they crossed the Red Sea and went across to the Sinai Peninsula. Well, that's not what it says. The Old Testament says that they crossed the Yam Suf, and that's the Reed Sea. That's not the Red Sea. That's the Reed Sea, and the Reed Sea is along the Mediterranean. So what we're looking for is the waters parting along the Mediterranean during the Santorini eruption. And of course, it would have done exactly that. It's a tsunami. And this, just to show people, in case people don't know what happens in a tsunami, everyone has seen the big wave come in Japan, maybe, or the Indonesian tsunamis. And they see this big flood coming in. But that's not what happens, of course. This was a subduction volcano in Santorini. So the land fell down, first of all, before it exploded. And so the first thing that will hit the northern Mediterranean coastline is the sea disappearing. And that's what happened. This is the Indonesian tsunami. And these ladies here are walking along the seabed. And the water has just disappeared. And they don't know what's going on. They're looking out. There's some white waves, on the horizon. But they're walking along the seabed.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I think the Egyptian army did.
It's so interesting.
What they don't realize, that these ladies here in this picture only have 5 minutes to live. Because that wave coming in will come in and it will sweep them away. And that is what happened to the Egyptian army.
This is unbelievable. Yeah.
And I think that's quite logical, because the Hyksos, remember, we're talking about the Hyksos Exodus. All of this happened during the Hyksos Exodus. The Santorini eruption was in 1600 BC, which is like 20 years before the Hyksos Exodus happened. So it's coincident. And so the Hyksos people lived in the delta. Now, Santorini had been huffing and puffing for several months before it actually exploded. This was not unexpected. The people of Santorini, because Santorini was a major hub of the Minoans. It was the Atlantis story of this marvelous civilization on this island that fell beneath the earth, beneath the waves. So it was high technology, it was high society, it was rich, it was wealthy. And yet all of those people left the island. Nobody has ever been found on Santorini underneath the pumice that fell down. So they evacuated the island. It was completely evacuated of people, which means we know that Santorini had been huffing and puffing for several months. They knew this was coming, something was coming, and so they evacuated the island. So the Hyksos people in Egypt would have seen mini tsunamis for the previous, 3-4 months. Okay, not big ones, but they would have seen the sea retreating, and they would know that like 5-10 minutes later, the sea is going to come in and wash people away. So the Hyksos army would have stayed clear, whereas the Egyptian army from the south, who had never been to the sea before, never even seen the sea, wouldn't know what's going on. And so they walk out along the beach to catch all the fish that are now flopping around on the sand. And then the sea comes back in and it captures the Egyptian army, which is exactly what it says in the Torah, of course. That's what it's talking about. The waves, the sea was parted, and then the sea came back in again and washed away the Egyptian army. Well, that is quite likely in a tsunami.
This is a story I've heard my whole life, and I'm sure lots of people have, especially in different sort of Christian countries and whatnot. This story of Moses going to Egypt. We're going to free our people. We're going to free the Jews. There's the skies covered in darkness for days. You have the pillar of fire, as you were saying. He parted the Red Sea, and the people crossed on their way to freedom. And these were all just acts of God. And you read about these, and you hear these when you're kids, and you see them in the movies and whatnot, and you go, well, how does this really make sense to real life when I look around today? But describing it as an event that happened of the largest volcano in history erupting and creating these kind of scenarios and walking through it is totally logical, and it's totally understandable how they would have wrote this down as like one of the most significant events to ever happen. And this is why it's part of our recorded history over time.
These are the sort of events that do get recorded and passed down. You can imagine them telling tales of this for hundreds of years afterwards, even before it was written down. Although the Hyksos, as we'll see in a minute, were highly literate. They could write it down. There was no need for oral transmission.
And we spoke about
highly literate.
Yeah. At the beginning of the show, we sort of spoke a bit about astro-theology and about how ancient man looked up to the heavens, and this was their religion before sort of these other religions that came later on. And so if they watched with great interest the stars, the movement of the sun, the equinoxes, the solstices, to then see the world get covered in darkness for days and pillars of fire, you must go, God's angry at us. There's something massive happening. And this is where the significance of this comes from with it. But yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. Yeah, so this is again, it's another of these books that doesn't have a title on the front. They love making these. This is the rhymed mathematical papyrus, which is a Hyksos document. So this comes from circa 1700 BC, and it's obviously all in Egyptian. All in hieroglyphs. And it's an A-level exam for students. So in Britain, when you get to age 18, you have A-level examinations to, check your proficiency in, sciences, history, whatever you're taking. And this is an Egyptian version of that. And it has all sorts of, this is a mathematical paper. And I think there's about 80 questions here. And you can see with this, all the little pyramids, it's asking things like, how do you calculate the area of the side of a pyramid?
Right. Yeah.
And they've translated it all, of course, so now you can read it in English. And it's highly complex algebra, mathematics, trigonometry. So you get these people saying that, algebra was invented by Islam because the name it's an Islamic name. It's an Arabic name. No, this is 1800 BC. This is 2,400 years before Islam was invented. And they were doing algebra with the Hyksos. So, yeah, this is a very important document, this one. And it's very interesting. It's some of the maths, they work it out differently. We're taught one way of doing, addition and multiplication. They do it a different way, but it works. But I've never heard of the method they use to do multiplication. It's I thought it was very complex, but I saw a mathematician who was saying, no, it's quite logical. You just do this, and it multiplies. And everything is in fractions. It must have taken forever when everything's in fractions. There's no decimals. Yeah. So yeah, very interesting book, very complex maths. I would say this is more difficult than a modern A-level. So, these were fairly good students in that era. And so, yes, if an event like Santorini happened, of course they could write it down. Of course they could leave us a complete record of that. And they did. One of the records is the Torah, which records the plagues and the Exodus. And the other is the Tempest Stela of Ahmose I, which records the same events. But in a much more prosaic fashion, because it's a history book, basically, written on a stela. But we've lost so much from that era, we don't know what was written. The Ahmose stela has only survived because it was a big lump of rock. And we were lucky that it...
Ahmose stela? I'm not familiar with it.
Is a pharaoh. He's the pharaoh of about 1580 BC, 1570 BC. He's a southern Egyptian pharaoh. So he's on the other side of the battle. So he was the person trying to throw out the Hyksos. So he's a pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, I presume. Yeah, 19th dynasty.
And this is a record from his time that they inscribed on a rock then? I see.
Tempest Stela to record these events, which records the expulsion of the Hyksos people. That's what the stela is about. That's why we know it's a real historical event, because we have these records,
This is on top of the work of Josephus Flavius, so this is another reference point.
It's another reference point, yeah.
Yes,
but
yes.
Quite often it's not linked because it comes from a different source. So it's certainly not linked with the Torah. Nobody will link the Tempest Stela with the Torah, although I do. But it's very similar to what Manetho is saying, the Egyptian historian. And of course, Manetho is quoted by Josephus, so we have that story from them as well. So we have multiple stories which link up this Exodus event into the into the Torah event. And if we've got more, and again, dear old Grok was desperately trying to say this is all coincidence, you know. Oh, it's all coincidence. You know, how many coincidences do you want, Grok? Because the next one is an ashfall. Now, why on earth would someone, for one of the plagues, dream up an ashfall? So it says that, you know, Moses took ash from the hearth of a fire and cast it up into the air, where it became a small dust across the whole of Egypt.
This is Volcano 101.
It's an odd story for a start, unless you know the history of this region, because there was an ashfall.
That's so interesting.
It's the ashfall from Santorini, but it happened in 1600 BC, not 1200 BC. And it did reach Egypt because they've drilled, you know, in the delta, and they found a small layer of ash. So it did reach all of Egypt. This is why there was 3 days of darkness.
This is so interesting.
This is why there was a tsunami, and this is the ash. So this is Santorini itself. We'll look where Santorini is in a minute. Do I have the map just waiting here? I know I've got a map somewhere because I put it in here.
Well, there's a map there. Yeah,
here it is.
Very good. So this is off the coast of Greece.
This is the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean. We've got Cyprus over here. We've got Egypt down the bottom here. And here's Crete. Thera is Santorini. It has two names depending on the antiquity. So Thera Santorini is here, just north of Crete. And these red lines are the lines of the tsunami as it raced out across the Eastern Mediterranean. So the tsunami would have hit Egypt. We know that. There's enough room between Crete and this is Turkey here. This is Rhodes, the island of Rhodes. There's enough room between those two islands for the tsunami to rush out across and hit Egypt. So that's where Santorini is, just above Crete. This is where the Yam Suf would have been, what they call the Red Sea now, but it's not, it's the Yam Suf, would have been on the eastern side of the Nile Delta down here. And that's why it got struck by a tsunami. But if we look at Santorini itself, this is the ash on Santorini, 60 meters deep. And you can see from this that there are layers all the way through this. So this was not one simple eruption. This was multiple eruptions all the way up here until we get to this top band here at the top. That was the major cataclysm where the whole of the island fell into the sea. So the center of Santorini fell into the water. It's now just a big caldera. It's just a big hole in the ground, basically. And that is the Atlantis story, of course, because originally Santorini had been a sunken, nested caldera. So inside the island, there were rings of land and sea, land and sea, land and sea, in concentric rings, because it was an old volcano that had been flooded by the sea, and therefore it had concentric rings inside it. So it's exactly the same as the Atlantis story claims for Atlantis.
That's interesting.
And then it fell into the sea in one great cataclysm, which it did. The whole island fell into the sea. but it gushed out before it fell into the sea. It gushed out all of this ash, a lot of which went over Anatolia, but a lot of it went down and landed on Egypt. And so there was a great ashfall. And Josephus goes, because again, Josephus has the more historical version. He says, he gives us extra details. He says that the air was too thick to breathe and people were inwardly consumed by the dust. Well, that's exactly what happens. This is Mount St. Helens. So this blew its top in, what is it, 1980s, I think, going back a little bit. Mount St. Helens was a volcano in America, which blew its top and spread dust. And this is the dust that fell on the local town. Well, local. It was about 30, 40 kilometers away, I think. Yeah. So, the dust is widespread everywhere. And
I remember even Iceland had one not long ago, wasn't that right?
Yeah.
The Icelandic volcano affected all the flights in Europe and things, I remember.
Yes. It downed quite a lot of flights, yes, because everyone was scared to fly into it because it inwardly consumed the engines on the aircraft. They had that famous British Airways 747, which lost all 4 engines. Not the Iceland one. This was somewhere down over Indonesia, and it flew into the cloud. And the trouble is with the dust cloud from a volcano is it contains silica shards. Now, in your lungs, that can puncture your lungs and give you internal injuries. You are inwardly consumed. In a jet engine, the jet engine runs so hot. Some of these Rolls-Royce jet engines run at 1800 degrees centigrade. Very, very hot. It will melt the silica. And then the silica, as it goes through the engine, it cools on some of the blades, because the blades are cooled, of course, otherwise they'd just simply melt, and builds up a residue on the blades, which disturbs the airflow, and the engine stops. And that's why they ended up with a glider, 747 glider, jumbo jet glider, which came down with no power from 30,000 foot all the way down to about 5,000 foot before they managed to restart 2 of the engines.
Wow.
But the same happened to the cars here, of course. This again is Mount St. Helens. And you can see they've had to put a huge, great filter on the front of the car to stop the car from gumming up all of the innards in the pistons and the valves and whatever, because the valves will do the same. The valves run so hot in a petrol car that all the silica will melt and bind onto the valve and stop it from working. The description we get is almost exact. We have this strange suggestion of an ashfall, in Egypt. Why would you get an ashfall? But more than that, we've not got one. We've got 4 or 5, what you might call black swan events. This is something that's come up in the last, 10, 15 years, I think. A black swan event is something that's so unpredictable, nobody could make it up. Why would you make up this stupid story? Because it's so absurd. It comes from Perth in Australia.
I know the story.
Because everyone knows what a swan is. A swan is a big white bird that swims along rivers, very majestic, very elegant.
And so the chance of seeing a black swan is like pigs flying. So this was an old phrase that would have been used here in the UK. A black swan? You're nuts. Yeah.
You would be nuts. You'd be laughed out of the classroom until you go to Perth.
Exactly.
Which for some very strange reason, because I used to live in Perth as well. So I'm familiar.
I used to live in Australia as well. Yeah.
And they have black swans down there.
Yes.
So this is known as a black swan event, something that's so unpredictable. Nobody could have made up this stupid story. But here we've got 4 or 5 of these black swans. We've got the darkness for 3 days. We've got the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke. We have this tsunami. And now we have a great ash fall. So what chronicler in ancient times could have linked all of those events together in one period of plagues that hit Egypt? And without being an eyewitness to those events, you could not, nobody in those days would have known what a maritime volcano will do unless they had actually been there and watched it. So this must be an eyewitness account of what they experienced. So the plagues are an eyewitness account of the long-range fallout from the Santorini Thera eruption. And that's why they had the Exodus, because they had the plagues. The gods were angry, obviously. Who was to blame? Well, it's got to be those people down there or those people up there. You know, both sides would have said it's the other person's fault, you know. It's those Hyksos for venerating Seth. Seth was the god of storms, of course. It's got to be the Hyksos fault. And because of that, they had this civil war. And they had this civil war which resulted in an exodus. But exactly the same happens in the Torah. There is a civil war. It's not just slaves being thrown out of Egypt. There is this civil war element before the Israelites are thrown out of Egypt. And so they're both thrown out of Egypt. There is hundreds of thousands of people that go on this exodus. And they leave from Pyramisi, which is Avaris, the capital of the Hyksos people. And they both go to Jerusalem. So the Hyksos are thrown out of Egypt and go to Jerusalem. And the Israelites are thrown out of Egypt and go to Jerusalem. We're not talking one similarity here between these two events. We're talking about multiple similarities. They both destroyed Jericho. So this is the other problem with the Exodus event. You see, if you get the historians will say, well, Jericho was destroyed in about 1560 BC. It's nothing to do with the Exodus event. So the Exodus as given to us in the Torah is completely wrong, because Jericho was deserted at that time during the Exodus. Well, yes, but only if you insist that the Exodus happened during the Ramesside period in 1200 BC. If you say it was the Hyksos Exodus, then there is no contention at all. It's the same event, because the Hyksos people destroyed Jericho, because they came out on their Exodus in about 1570 BC, and that's exactly when Jericho was destroyed. And I think the best arguments I've seen for this come from Ahmad Osman, and he writes, I forget which book this is in. Anyway, one of his books is Stranger in the Valley of the Kings, which is all about the Joseph story. Joseph, you know, him of the coat of many colors. He makes a very good argument that the Hyksos destroyed Jericho. And so here we have another element, because both of these stories ended up with Jericho being destroyed and the walls tumbling down. Mm-hmm. Actually, they didn't really tumble down. Again,
can you walk us through a little bit of the story of Jericho again for people that are not super familiar with this?
Yeah. All of these stories are embellished. So you have to understand that they're not writing history, they're writing a story of a people and embellishing that story, obviously to make themselves look favorable, although God does keep punishing them all the time, you know. So you've got to be careful of this God, and he's a bit capricious, you know. If you do the wrong thing, he'll punish you. He's not a very nice God, this one. But anyway, they come up to Jericho, which is, you know, Jericho is on the shores of the Dead Sea. So it's when these people were actually sort of entering towards Judea, Israel. And it was obviously inhabited by an enemy people, and they wanted to take take Jericho. And so one of the ploys, the siege went on for quite some time. One of this ploys was they circled the walls of Jericho, and it did have big walls. It was a walled city. And then they blew their trumpets. You can see all the people here blowing the trumpets. And because they blew the trumpets, the walls fell down. Well, that's, of course, that's the biblical sort of interpretation. What actually happened, and what it actually says in the Torah, if you bother to read the story, is that while this was going on, Rahab, who was a prostitute who lived in Jericho, opened the doors of the city gates to allow the Israelites in. Or was it that she let down a rope so the Israelites could climb up the wall into her window, and then they went to open the gates? Anyway, via Rahab, the prostitute, the gates of the city were open. So if you read between the lines, it's fairly obvious what happened. They were making this big diversion with them going around the city, blowing trumpets. So everyone would look over the walls, maybe on the south side, while someone was busy opening the gates on the north side. It was a diversion tactic, to get into the city. Most of these cities, very few cities actually capitulate because the walls are broken down. Most of them capitulate because someone manages to get in the gate or whatever. And that's exactly what I think happened. And this is AI again. AI gets things completely wrong. But anyway, Jericho didn't look like this, but
gives us an idea. Yeah.
Yeah, it gives us an idea. This is not Grok. This was one of the other AI platforms, ChatGPT or something. And you've got the Israelites with their trumpets, blowing trumpets, and the walls are supposed to be falling down. Anyway, Jericho was destroyed. That's a historical event. But it happened in 1570 odd BC.
But the mainstream historians think it happened at a later date.
No. Mainstream historians say it happened in 1570 BC, and that's why it cannot be attached to the Exodus story, because the Exodus story is supposed to have happened in
later
1200. But of course, if you equate the Exodus with the Hyksos Exodus, then
it makes
they're
perfect
at
sense.
the same time. They're perfectly, they match. Yeah, so again, this is good evidence, I think, that the Israelite Exodus was the Hyksos Exodus. And then we get Josephus Flavius says so. So here's another reason for believing they are the same story. Josephus Flavius, quoting through Manetho and commenting on Manetho, the Egyptian historian, he says that the Hyksos were described as captives in our sacred books of his country. In this statement, Manetho is correct. Sheep breeding was a hereditary custom of our remotest ancestors. And from this nomadic life, they were called shepherds. But their other name of these captives in the Egyptian records, the Hyksos, they were called captives, of course. You can translate Hyksos as captives. This was not given without reason, since our ancestor Joseph told the king of Egypt that he was a captive. So in two occasions here, he's linking the Israelites with the Hyksos. And then he goes on and he says, such is Manetho's account. The so-called shepherds. Yes. Okay, so he says, such is Manetho's account. And if the years he enumerates are summed up, it is clear that the so-called shepherds, the Hyksos, our ancestors, left Egypt and settled in our country 393 years before Danas came to Argos. He's trying to date the era of the Exodus. If you add the king list given in the previous passage, that's not a quote. That's something else. So he calls the so-called shepherds our ancestors, or in some translations it says our forefathers. So he is directly equating the Israelites with the Hyksos. He says they are the same people, our ancestors. So all the way through my works, I call them the Hyksos Israelites, because it's so obvious that they must be one and the same people. Which explains the whole of the early Exodus story within the Torah. So what it's doing here is it's demonstrating that the Torah story is real history. It's the real history of the Hyksos people. So all you need to do, because they're always looking for evidence that the Bible is true. And then I come along and I show them evidence that the Bible is true. And they say, no, it can't be that. No. And the reason they're saying, no, it can't be that is because, A, it pushes the story back by 370 years, which is inconsequential, really. That, to me, that doesn't matter. B, it means that the Israelites were not slaves in Egypt. They were the Hyksos shepherd kings, the most powerful people in Egypt, the people who brought the composite bow and the chariot and the horse into Egypt. These were a dominant people who controlled Egypt, except for the south. They were not slaves to the evil Egyptians. They were actually controlling the Egyptians until they were thrown out in about 1570 BC. And you might say, well, if they were so powerful and they were so clever and they wrote this, rhymed mathematical papyrus and so on, how on earth did they manage to get thrown out? Well, Britain did exactly the same. So Britain went to, let's take India and other places. We went to India. We controlled the whole of India with, they say, only about 250,000 people. So there were not many Brits there at all. Yet we controlled the whole of India for 200 years or so.
India's population would have been about 300 million, if
something of that nature. Yeah. So a small population can control a large population if you have the technology and the superior society in order to do it. But eventually, of course, we were thrown out of Egypt. There are no English people. They say we're colonizers in Egypt. Well, there's no colonies in Egypt, in India. There are no English colonies sitting in India at present. It was just a controlling elite that controlled the whole of the nation. And that is what the Hyksos were. They were a controlling elite who controlled the Egyptian people because they had superior weapons, because they had superior technology and understanding. And that can last for a long time. But eventually, if the people have an uprising, there is more of them than there are of you.
Yeah.
And
if a large volcano goes off and you think the world's ending, you'll be like, here, get out of here.
You can get
what are you guys up to?
Well, the other problem, of course, is the people learn. Rome had the same problem. Rome was superior to the Germans. But of course, the Germans were learning from the Romans in terms of their army structure and their weaponry and everything else. Well, the same happened in India. We were superior to the Indians, but the Indians started learning in terms of weaponry and control, because, our army in India was substantially Indian. It was largely composed of Sikhs. Well, now they know all of the structures and the mechanisms for controlling an army of this nature. And that army can turn against you. So, the easy way to think of the Hyksos Israelites, when they were in Egypt, is that they were the same as the British in India. and they controlled the region for about the same amount of time, about 200 years or so, until they finally got kicked out on the Great Hyksos Exodus.
And where do you think
the story?
Yeah. Where do you think this rewriting happened of making them the persecuted, the slaves, all of that, instead of sort of this highborn sort of class of people?
I think this happened on the Babylonian exile. So the Hyksos Israelites ended up in Jerusalem. Actually, I have a whole story about them going elsewhere as well. They went to Greece, they went to the Mediterranean islands, they went to Spain, they went to Ireland, they went to Scotland in the Queen Scota. We will go through the Scota story later, but there is another Exodus, a very ancient record of an Exodus out of Egypt that goes to Scotland. So they went all over the Mediterranean basin, but mostly they went to Jerusalem. But then, and so they made a whole civilization there in Judea and Israel. And then they had the united monarchy of King David and King Solomon, so they were very successful. But I say that David and Solomon were in northern Egypt more than they were in Judea. But they did control all of Judea and Israel as well. But then in the 6th century BC, the Babylonians came down and conquered them. And this is the Babylonian exile, where the Jews were taken into exile by the Babylonians and ended up in Iraq, modern Iraq. And so these were a captive people who actually became very successful there, who were being used as slaves, obviously, in modern Iraq, in Babylon. And they created their Torah. So they were avid scribes over there in Babylon, and they created the Babylonian Talmud, which came from Babylon, and the Torah was mostly written in Babylon. And so I think it was them who were deciding that, oh, woe is us, we are slaves in Babylon. We were slaves in Egypt. Woe unto the Babylonians, woe unto the Egyptians. They're all persecuting us, We're at the whim of these major empires. We're just a small people, we have to stick together. And I think this is when this idea of Egypt becoming the evil nation was devised. But these people in Babylon actually became very successful, and they controlled Babylon. The commerce of Babylon was run by the Hyksos Israelites right up until 1950. So all of modern Iraq was controlled by the Jews, by the Hyksos Israelites, up until 1950, when they were all kicked out on the Jewish Nakba. So, everyone complains about the Palestinian Nakba, when a lot of people were exiled from Judea and Israel. This would have been in, late 40s, early 1950s. And, woe unto the Palestinians, they were all kicked out. Well, 1 million Jews were kicked out of North Africa and out of Iraq on the Jewish Nakba at the very same time. There was this big population exchange. And they were very wealthy because they ran Iraq. And so the last king of Iraq, Jewish king of Iraq, the last exilarch, was Naim Dangur. And he was kicked out in the early 50s, I think, early 1950s. And he still has, if he's still alive, I'm not sure if he's still, because he must be quite old by now. He had a claim in with the UN for about $50 billion in lost assets, because these people controlled the commerce in Iraq up until 1950s. And then they were all kicked out. So there was this huge, so the Israelites were in Iraq from 600 BC, roughly,
this Babylonian
during the
time.
Babylonian exile. all the way up to 1950, when they were kicked out by the Muslims. So this is all modern. It might be ancient history, but it's all modern as well. These things are still going on to this very day.
Yeah.
It's
great to shine a light on it. Yeah.
Yes. It is pertinent to what's actually happening now. It's, again, if we don't understand history, we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes.
Yeah. A man that doesn't know history is like a tree without roots, isn't it? Like,
that's another famous old saying. Yes, it is.
Yeah. Have we finished the story then from Exodus? So we have the Hyksos. These were these shepherd kings then in Egypt. We had this great cataclysm happen of this volcano erupting, the largest in history. That's what led to this, the blackened sky, the pillar of fire, the ash, and the plagues of Egypt. That led to the parting of the Red Sea as part of this sort of natural phenomenon of the volcano erupting. That gave the opportunity, or not the opportunity, but the Hyksos then were kicked out. They were sort of blamed for this. They crossed then into Jerusalem, where they came upon Jericho, which is where then they try to take over that city, I guess, to establish a new sort of settling. Is that correct? And then I think that's where we've got up to in the story. Where does it lead on to then from there?
Well, then essentially we come on to the Skota story, where they go across the Mediterranean, they go to Greece, they obviously go to Jerusalem and set up Jerusalem. Then we skip a number of years, and my next book on this, which we'll probably do in another talk, is The United Monarchy of David and Solomon, because that follows on from this. That has been misappropriated as well. Not in date this time. The chronology is correct for the United Monarchy, but in location. I say they were based in Zoan, not in Zion. So not in Jerusalem. Their main base was in Tanis, in Egypt. So that's a story for another day. The Skota story, because some of these exiles from this land at the very same time, from a later time, because there were two exoduses. Yeah, we might as well go through this as well. We've been talking about the Great Exodus, but Manetho says there were two Exodus events. And the second Exodus event was the 80,000 lepers and maimed priests who were kicked out of Egypt. And this would have been during the Amarna dynasty of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And they ended up going to Spain and to Ireland and to Scotland. But we might as well look at the Amarna dynasty, because this goes back into the beginnings of the Old Testament. I'm just bringing up a screen share.
What time frame is this roughly that we're looking at? Nefertiti and Akhenaten, and
Nefertiti, Akhenaten, we're talking about 1330, 1320 BC. So we're talking, what's that? After the main Exodus, 1570, we're talking 250 years later. And these people come back into Egypt via the Joseph story. Now, I don't write about Joseph because I think that was fully covered by Ahmad Osman, who equates Joseph, the Old Testament Joseph, with Yuya and Thuyu. So I don't have an image of Yuya, I don't think, here. Why did I not do that? No, I don't think I do. Anyway, Yuya was a very, very influential aristocrat, because he wasn't royal as such, but he did marry into the royal family. He was a very important aristocrat who became the prime minister of Egypt, just the same as Joseph became the prime minister of Egypt. And he is the patriarch of the Amarna dynasty of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. So they were all descended from Yuya and Thuyu. And they were all ginger, of course. We will come across the ginger monarchy. they're all of these pharaohs. Ramesses II was ginger.
Yeah.
So there's a big strand of ginger runs through these royal families. Same as in Greece, most of the heroes of the Iliad were all ginger. Well, they say golden haired, but you can understand what they're talking about. But this takes us back to the Genesis story, because I didn't touch the Genesis story because it's obviously fictional. It's a made up fictional story. None of it can be rationalized into real history.
Mm-hmm.
Until I started studying the Amarna dynasty and realized there are many parallels between the two. And I think that Genesis has been misinterpreted as a foundational story, what do you call it? A foundation myth of the nation, when it wasn't. It was a foundation myth of this particular sect within Egypt, because, of course, Akhenaten was of a different religion to everybody else. He was the first of the monotheists. If you read Sigmund Freud with his Moses and monotheism, again, he links it back into Akhenaten, who was the first monotheist. He got rid of all the gods. He literally destroyed all of the gods, hacked them out of the temple walls, closed all of the temples down in Upper Egypt, and instituted his one only god, which was the Aten or Arden. And of course, the Jewish god is known as the Arden. It has the same name. So the Jewish god is Yahweh. We all know Yahweh. But he's also El, Elohim, Allah. So the Arabic Allah comes from the Torah. Shaddai, the god of the storm god, and Ardon. So the Jewish god is known as the Ardon, exactly the same as Akhenaten did. So here we have an image of Adam and Eve from the Genesis story. And what is the Genesis story? It's a story of two naked lovebirds in the Garden of Eden. And the god of Akhenaten is the Aton, or the Ardon. It's spelt in both fashions. But it's spelt with a reed glyph. And the reed glyph, as we saw before, is better pronounced as an I rather than A. So the god of Akhenaten is the Eton, or the Eden. And all of these pharaohs had a garden, which was a garden for the gods. So they made these ornamental gardens they did the same in Babylon, but in Babylon they were known as paradise. It was the garden of the gods, is a paradise.
Yeah.
So they had these formal gardens, the same as you have, if you go to a big country house in Britain, you'll find these big ornamental gardens. That is a paradise. And Akhenaten did the same. He made his own paradise, which was the Garden of Eden. And if we look at the Genesis story, Genesis 2:8, probably 2:10 is best. A river came out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted and became 4 heads, or 4 branches. Well, there's only one river that does that in that era, in this sort of part of the world, and that's the River Nile. The River Nile runs through Egypt, and it gets to the sort of Cairo-type region, and it parted and became 4 branches. It doesn't now. It only has 2 branches, but in that sort of era, it had 4 branches. So it gives us a good idea that maybe Genesis is talking about Egypt, not about Mesopotamia, which is where most people put the story. And So we have two naked lovebirds in the Garden of Eden, and they were this chap.
Akhenaten.
This is Akhenaten. And the funny thing about Akhenaten, which is most peculiar in the history of Egypt, is he always portrayed himself as naked. So on the left, we have Akhenaten, who's king of Egypt, Pharaoh of Egypt, and he has obviously ordered his sculptors to draw himself naked. Now, no sculptor would be bold enough to do that, without being sanctioned by the king himself. But here he has been portrayed as both naked and also androgynous. And that's important because we have here an androgynous primeval Adam, because I link this guy up with Adam. So the two naked lovebirds we have in the Genesis story are Adam and Eve, and the two naked lovebirds here are Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And Akhenaten is androgynous. He has no genitalia, and he's slightly effeminate looking as well. And that's important because we come across that in the biblical story in the Gospels later on. We will come across, in the Gospels, they are known as the Galli, or the Galileans, or the Nazarene. And the Nazarene believed in the primeval Adam. Well, here is the primeval Adam. Is this guy.
Fascinating.
And the lady next door, that's Nefertiti. And again, she has been portrayed as naked. Now, this was undoubtedly shocking to the people of Egypt. You can imagine, the Queen of Britain appearing on the balcony at Buckingham Palace, naked.
Yeah.
I think that might cause a bit of an uproar in
there might be a headline or two. Yeah.
And I think it did in Egypt as well, because this wasn't known in Egypt, this informality, this hippie cult, I call it.
So he came in, he had all the old gods of Egypt. He's like, let's get rid of all of those. There's only one God. This was the start of monotheism. And he started, because the pharaohs were seen not just as kings, but as priest kings. They were the leader of the religion, if I'm correct in that with it. So he came out, said, it's all different. You're going to worship these kind of androgynous type figures. Then also there's this unification of opposites that might have been part of, I guess, that theology or something to do with that. Can you color in this story a little bit more then, if you want to continue on, actually? Yeah.
Or
what do you think prompted him to do that? Is there, or is it just an unknown? Yeah.
The reason is twofold. One is his connections with Crete and the Minoans, because the Minoans have been kicked out of Santorini. We've talked about that. A lot of these, and Minos itself, Crete, was heavily affected by this tsunami, of course. They bore the brunt of this tsunami. The tsunami in northern Crete went up to 20 meters. I mean, this was a devastating. There was many of the cities were never re-inhabited. People started inhabiting mountain tops because they were so fearful that they would get washed away again. So the Minoan Empire started to collapse after this great tsunami. And a lot of them fled to Egypt. And so we know there was a Minoan palace was built in Egypt. And so there were all of these influences coming in from the Minoans. And the new artistry, which is Akhenaten is famous not only for his new god, but his new artistry. His free-flowing, naturalistic artistry you see all over Amarna. That's Minoan. That's pure Minoan. It comes straight out of Minos. So that was one influence, was the different culture from the Minoans. The second was the problem of this antagonism between the bulls and the sheep. So I'll just stop this because we'll sit and talk about Joseph for a bit.
The bulls and the sheep, is this to do with the change in the astrological age? Is this?
Yeah. But if you read this in the Torah, it's talked about in terms of agriculture. But of course, it's nothing to do with agriculture. So Joseph, when he comes back down into Egypt, so this is the story of the Hyksos Israelites coming back down into Egypt. And he comes down as a slave, but becomes the prime minister of Egypt. So now there's a clue for you for a start. So one of the things I say in my text is that Hebrew, Aramaic, is a daughter language of Egyptian. It's the same language. So modern Jews are speaking Egyptian, a dialect of Egyptian. Because that's obvious. I mean, Joseph was prime minister of Egypt. What language do you think he spoke? He would have spoken fluent Egyptian. And of course, the Hyksos spoke fluent Egyptian. And of course, anyone that's going into a new land, they will tend to speak the language of the native peoples. And so that's exactly what happened. They started speaking Egyptian. But Joseph, what am I talking about? Oh, yes, Joseph coming back down into Egypt. He comes back down into Egypt. He becomes prime minister of Egypt. And then he invites his family down into Egypt. So his brothers all come down into Egypt. The famous 12 brothers. And so he arranges a meeting with Pharaoh. And this is interesting because I think this is an actual verbatim record of what happened at this time. You know, someone was writing this down as it happened, and we have a verbatim account of what they said. So he says to his brothers, look, you're going to meet Pharaoh. Whatever you do, don't say we are shepherds, because shepherds are hated by the Egyptians. Nobody says why, you know. There was no prohibition on eating sheep or whatever, you know, within Egypt. So you've got to say to Pharaoh that you are bull herders. Otherwise, you'll get thrown out of Egypt. So, but they don't do that. They actually tell Pharaoh that they are shepherds. So what's this talking about? Well, if you read it in the biblical commentaries and the theologians, they'll say that they are shepherds. It's all given to us in terms of agriculture. Of course, it was nothing to do with agriculture. What he's saying is, you're going to meet Pharaoh. Don't say that you are shepherd kings, the Hyksos, because they are hated by the Egyptians. Well, of course they were, because they'd just been thrown out of Egypt completely by the Egyptians.
When did they return then to Egypt? And can you color in who is Joseph? Because when people hear Joseph, they think Jesus is father. Who are we speaking about here in the Old Testament here, just for your average Joe?
Yeah, this is the Old Testament Joseph. So he was one of the famous 12 brothers of. Gosh, I hope I don't get this wrong. Of Jacob, and so they are coming back down into Egypt, because even according to my story and to the biblical story, they were in Judea. They were coming back down into Egypt.
There's a couple hundred years after.
The Hyksos would have been coming back down into Egypt. This would have been after the major Exodus,
yes,
which was 1570 BC. This would have been circa 1380, 1360 BC.
So
because
years after
Osman, and I agree with Osman in his record, he says that Joseph was Yuya, the patriarch of the Amarna dynasty. And in the biblical story, Joseph is this, poor lad who's taken down into Egypt against his will. He's kidnapped, basically, taken into Egypt, brought up by the high priest of Heliopolis, has various stories, which we won't go into, but then manages to claw his way up into being the prime minister of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh, the richest man in the whole of Egypt, because after the famines, which he predicts, he's obviously an astrologer because he predicts these famines, the famines come across, he stored up the grain before the famine, and then he can sell the grain to the people when the famine is on. And so he made an absolute fortune selling this grain to the people. And then he got the people to agree that he would get a 20% tithe on all of the agriculture of Egypt.
It's quite a lucrative deal.
He was richer than Pharaoh. Richest man in the whole of Egypt. And then
sorry, just one quick wee question. He was the brother of Jacob. Who's Jacob in the Old Testament? This is one of the leaders of... just who is Jacob in the Old Testament as well? Just give people this context and we'll keep charting forward.
Jacob.
Was he one of the leaders of Israel or of course, the Jews at the time? That's what it is. That's who they're writing about.
We have this famous story, which we might as well go into because it shows you what the...
Not to take you off too much on a tangent here. Yeah, we'll get back to it.
It's a little tangent, but it's an interesting tangent. It shows you that the Torah story, the biblical texts, are sufficiently different to how you think to be real history. Because you would, if you were making this story up, you would not make this story. You would make this story softer than it is, and it's being played down, of course. So this is the story of Jacob's sons. One of his sons is Reuben, and he has whose mother is Leah. So one of his wives is Leah, and then his younger wife, he had two wives at least, was Rachel, who was much younger and much prettier than poor old Leah. And so we get this contention between these two wives. So it says, the two wives of Jacob, it says, Reuben, that's his son, went into the wheat harvest and found the mandrakes in a field and brought them to his mother, Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, give me your son's mandrakes. And she said unto her, it's a small matter that you have taken my husband, because she's the younger wife. Would you also take away my son's mandrakes as well? And Rachel said, well, then Jacob will sleep with you tonight and have sex with you for your son's mandrakes. So Jacob came into the field in the evening, and Leah went out to meet him and said, you must sleep with me tonight, for I've hired you with my son's mandrakes. A mandrake is an apple.
Right.
And it's just a terrible translation because it makes no sense, does it? It makes absolutely no sense.
This was quite the tangent.
Well, it's a tangent, but it's important because it shows you how you have to read the Old Testament texts. You have to read them with a rational eye as to what these people were talking about. And what are the big things that people talk about in ancient times? They talk about wars, they talk about harvests, they talk about sex. A mandrake is a love apple. It translates as love or sex in the Hebrew. So if you translate it, it suddenly makes sense. So it says, and Reuben went in the days of the wheat harvest and found love in the field. He'd had a quick wank, obviously, and brought it to his mother Leah. And Rachel, the younger wife, said to Leah, give me your son's love. So she wants to have sex with her stepsister's son. But Leah says to her, so you have taken my husband, the younger wife has taken the husband, and now you want to take away my son's love as well. And Rachel said, okay, so Jacob can sleep with you tonight because he was not sleeping with Leah anymore. Jacob can sleep with you tonight in exchange for your son's love. So Jacob came out of the field in the evening, and Leah went out to meet him, saying, you must sleep with me tonight, for I have hired your love with my son's love. And Jacob lay with her that night, and she had another child. So she's exchanging. Leah, the older wife, cannot have access to Jacob anymore because she's the older wife. So she gives her younger son to Rachel, the younger wife, so that she can sleep with Jacob again. So these are the interplays between these families. Yeah. And again, you would not write this story if this was not real history. It's too embarrassing. It's too it's not the sort of impression you want to give, and that's why it's been covered up in the English. So you can see how you need to read these
between the lines of it.
Between the lines of these stories, it's very interesting. So these are the characters involved in this story. But Joseph comes down into Egypt. He is the prime minister of Egypt. He invites his sons down, and he says to Pharaoh, don't say that you are Hyksos shepherd kings, because they are an abomination to the Egyptians. Well, of course they were, because the Hyksos had a civil war with the southern Egyptians. So of course they would disliked and would not be allowed into Egypt if Pharaoh knew that they were Hyksos shepherd kings. And the other side of this story, of course, was the bull worshippers, because they were still worshipping the Apis bull of Egypt. And here we get the contention between the shepherds and the bull worshippers, which, as you say, is the procession of the equinox. It's the great month of Taurus versus the great month of Aries, which changed in 1750 BC, just before the shepherd kings, the Hyksos, became a thing. So some people had changed over to the new great month of Aries, and some people had not. And the southern Egyptians had obviously clung on to the Apis bull worshippers. And that's why on the second Exodus, the smaller Exodus, Moses killed all of the bull worshippers, because they were still adhering to the great month of Taurus.
These are the worshippers of the golden calf?
Yep, the golden calf. And they're not only worshipping the golden calf, but he kills them all as well. So Moses kills 3,000 of these bull worshippers during the Exodus. So this wasn't a peaceful Exodus. This was a major ongoing battle. These people were thoroughly Egyptian. And we know that from their names. If I just bring up their names, because we have their names in the Egyptian, of course. So we have a different view. So these are the names of these various characters in the Egyptian, as given in the Egyptian record. So we have 2 records. We've got the biblical record, 3 records. We've got the Josephus record, and we've got the Manetho record as well. Manetho mentions these people as well. And so if we look at the top, Moses in these historical records was called Ososeph. And Ososeph, well, Seph means son of in Egyptian. So an Osar is Osiris. Manetho says that, his name was based on Osiris. So we get the son of Osiris, and this is the name in the Egyptian hieroglyphs. This is Seph here, S-F, Seph, and the determinative here is the son. It means son of. and this is Osiris, the name for Osiris. Joseph is, if you just take that as an Egyptian word instead of a Hebrew word, is Yah-Seth. Yo is Yah. Yah is the moon god. So Joseph means the son of the moon in Egyptian. And here again, Seth is son of, and this is Yah, which is the moon god. Now, in the works of Manetho, Joseph is called Petaseth. And nobody has made a translation of that. I don't know why, because it's so obvious. It's not Peter, it's not Peta, although it is Peter. That's what it became eventually in the Greek. It's Ptah. And Ptah is the god of Freemasonry, basically, the god of Masons. So Ptah is the original Freemason, as it were. So Joseph was called Petaseth, which is the son of Ptah. And here we have son of again, and this is the name for Ptah, the god of Freemasonry and woodworking, carpenters. Now there's a clue, isn't there?
Yeah.
But Joseph was also called in the biblical text Sephnath Panish. That was the name given in the works of Josephus and the Torah, because they tried to give you the Egyptian names of these people. Now, Sephnath, again, it's not translated. Nobody has translated this before. It has to be Seth, son of, we've already come across that a number of times, and Neith, who is the goddess who is married to Ptah. So it just has to be Sephneith, not Sephnath, but Sephneith, because these are man and wife gods. And so, yes, Joseph would have been the son of Ptah and the son of Neith, because they were married to each other. So it makes perfect sense in the translation, which it gives us an idea that the Torah is actually real history, because again, they're quoting the right names in the right context out of ancient Egypt. These are Egyptian names, and it makes perfect sense. So here again, son of Neith. So this is Seth again, son of, and this is the hieroglyphs for Neith. Neta. Sometimes she's called Net, but more often is Neith. And then his other name, Joseph, was called Panich, which does mean my counselor. And Joseph was the counselor to Pharaoh. And then we get Aseneth and Potipharah, which I've translated as well. Potipharah was the priest that Joseph stayed with and was brought up with. So, yeah, those are interesting. It gives us confidence that it's talking about real history, yeah. In the Joseph story. So yeah, that is Joseph coming down into Egypt, who so Joseph would have been Yuya, who was the patriarch of the Amarna dynasty of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And so what I think they were is this.
Guessing that's AI.
Could be AI, yes.
Maybe.
Complete with hippie glasses as well. They were the hippie pharaohs, because that's exactly what they were. It's difficult, projecting yourself back. This is like 1320 odd BC. That far in the past, what these people were like. But they were, the hippie commune of the era, because Akhenaten was this radical new pharaoh. He was known as the heretic pharaoh, who had this new idea about the gods. He was into monotheism. He instituted monotheism. He carved out the names of all of the old gods and destroyed them, closed all of their temples down. and made his own new city down in Amarna, which is in central Egypt. Now, he didn't really go there voluntarily. I think he was chased there because his father was still alive. Amenhotep III was still alive. And I think he was kicked out by his father. So he stuck up 2 fingers. There's his 2 fingers there in the picture, to his father, and he went to make his own commune in Middle Egypt, which is known as Amarna, or then it was Akhenaten was its original name, which was a new city that had to be built from nothing. There was nothing there at all. So they had to have, and this is where we get the slave story from, a whole load of slaves, i.e. his followers. Manetho says he went there with 80,000 lepers and maimed priests. Now, they weren't real lepers, of course. They were theological lepers. This is what it's all about. It's a change in the theology of Egypt. Maimed priests because, well, they believed in the Arten instead of the old gods. And these 80,000 people went into Middle Egypt on the east bank of the Nile, which is where Amarna is, to build this new city. And he turned into a tyrant. So, I mean, he's portrayed as a hippie, but of course, most hippies become tyrants given half a chance. And his story is the same as Wild Wild Country.
Yeah.
So if anyone has watched Wild Wild Country by, it's a Netflix series, isn't it?
Yeah, it's on Netflix. Yeah.
And it's a story about the
Indian guru. Yes.
Yeah, what was his name? It
begins with O. It'll come to me in a second.
Yeah. Anyway, this Indian guru got kicked out of Egypt. Got kicked out of India.
Yes.
And went down into Oregon and set up his new hippie commune down there. And that's exactly what Akhenaten did. And their 2 stories parallel very closely.
I'm almost sure that he must have had some incidents with psychedelics that led to this total psychological transformation.
It did. I mean, they were around, of course, in those days.
Yeah.
There would have been...
I totally see this as a thing happening because it comes into our later story when we get to sort of the first century of Judea with it and looking at sort of what the Gnostics were up to, these kind of cults with it. But, because these were all just John Allegro's sort of theories. These were mushroom people, but this is way later down in the story. We're laying the groundwork for something here. Yeah.
Well, yes, we had that with... We had that with the later story of the exile to Saba. One of the primary products of Saba, which is modern Yemen, was hash. Of course, that was how they ran their society. Their economy was based on hash.
On hash, right?
So I've no doubt that there were various sort of psychedelics that were being used in that time.
So I'm sure it was a part of ancient rites and rituals, same in sort of what happened with ancient Greek and things, So this is fascinating. Yeah, this is really interesting.
Yeah, the guy was called Ranjish. So he took his commune down into Oregon, and they had to build a new city from scratch because there was nothing there. So he had all of these followers, all of these, a guru normally has hundreds of followers, and he had, I don't know what it was, a couple of thousand followers.
Mm-hmm.
And they had to build this town from nothing. So they were working like Bilio. They were real slaves working for Ranjish and building this new city. And of course, it was a city of free love and, peace and right on, man, This was real hippie stuff. Just like Akhenaten, I'm sure it was exactly the same. But then, of course, Ranjish started to become a tyrant. In fact, it was his second in command. I forget this lady's name who took up the second in command position. And she was more of a tyrant than he was. And it all started to fall apart. They tried to poison the local normal town. with poisons. They started to have armed guards on every street, to make the people work harder and so on. They degenerated into tyranny. And that's where we get the story of the Israelites being slaves, where that is derived from. Because this Akhenaten hippie would have been sitting there shouting to his followers, "You are idle, you are idle. You must make mud bricks, whether there's straw or no straw. You must make the same quota of bricks." And that's what they were actually doing down in Amarna, because when they excavated the burials, they had these mass burials down there. The common people were being worked to death. You can even see their injuries on their bones and how they were being given hard labor constantly, so their bones actually changed shape in this mass burial. So for all of his hippie commune, free lovebirds, naked lovebirds in the Garden of Eden, the actual people were working their socks off, working their fingers to the bone to build this new city for Akhenaten, out of mud bricks and out of stone, and also building their tombs. They made all of their tombs down there as well. But all of this had to be built from nothing by this 80,000 followers who were being worked to the bone by Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And that's where we get this idea that the Israelites were slaves. They were slaves to Pharaoh, as it says. But what they won't tell you is which Pharaoh was the tyrant. And the reason they won't tell you is because the tyrannical Pharaoh was their own Pharaoh. It was Akhenaten himself. And that's where we get this story of Akhenaten, another AI picture, and his 6 daughters. Why did Akhenaten only have daughters? 6 daughters and no sons. Well, the Torah tells us why. It's because the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, killed all of the sons of the Israelites. Now, that would be impossible, of course, 2 midwives killing all of the sons of all of the Israelites in Israel, simply not possible. But of course, killing the sons of the Pharaoh, of the leader, well, that will have the same effect, isn't it? You're nullifying the royal line by killing all of the sons. And that's why Akhenaten only had daughters and no sons. Again, it fits with the story very, very closely. And so does this. This is the song to the Aten. We won't go through this because we're sort of running out of time a bit. But the hymn to the Aten is in Psalms. So, and the hymn to the Aten is a very famous hymn, supposedly written by Akhenaten himself. But it was adopted and put into Psalms in the Torah. And it's virtually identical. It's the same. And so this song, which would have been sung, I think, to the rising Aten, to the rising sun, probably by Nefertiti. This is supposed to be an image of Nefertiti singing the hymn to the Aten, is in the biblical texts. An actual hymn written by Pharaoh Akhenaten is in the biblical text. So that's how close this story does become to the real history. And of course, if we're going back to Genesis, this is the tree of life. And it's a real tree of life. It's a family tree, the same as we would portray it now, having a family tree. But this is a pharaonic family tree. So this is down from the Temple of Karnak, of course, in Egypt. And we have Thoth here on the left, the god of scribes. And he's scribing the name of the pharaoh onto the fruits. And this pharaoh happens to be Seti I. So if you're plucking the fruits from the tree of life, you're plucking the Pharaoh's name from the family tree, from the ancestral tree. And that's pretty much what Akhenaten was doing, of course. He was plucking out all the names of the gods, and probably the names of the pharaohs too. And that's why it was condemned, because you were not supposed to destroy the names of the gods and the pharaohs. But if you were doing that, of course, you would be condemned. And that's exactly what Akhenaten and Nefertiti were. Although, just to sort of finish on that, this is Jacob and Lee. This is Lee, is the younger wife who wanted sex with his elder son.
Yeah.
But there we go. It was a good barter. It was a very good barter.
That's funny. Yeah. Just to make sure I'm following correctly, again, the link between the Hyksos kicked out of Egypt, there was a return a couple hundred years later with Joseph and that. How does the Hyksos link with Akhenaten then? What was this exactly?
Well, they would have been returning Hyksos.
So they'd have been another pharaoh came back.
Yeah, they're not called Hyksos anymore, of course.
Yeah.
But the Hyksos moved out and went into the Nile Delta.
Yeah.
And obviously to Jerusalem and across the Mediterranean. So in these big Exodus events. But there were still elements, I'm sure, in northern Egypt of the Hyksos. And so when Joseph came back down into Egypt, he would have been of Hyksos stock, with all of the customs and traditions and history of the Hyksos, coming back down into Egypt to retake over their ancestral lands. Because they had been there previously, they'd been kicked out. Let's go and retake those lands, which they successfully did. They took it back over again until they were kicked out on another Exodus. So again, it didn't last for that long. We're only talking 30, 40 years. But Akhenaten was kicked out of Egypt.
He was part of that lineage then as well.
Yeah. Akhenaten was descended from Joseph. If Joseph was Yuya and Thuyu, they were the patriarch and matriarch of the Amarna dynasty of Akhenaten. So he was descended effectively from Jacob. And so the two brothers that we have on the Exodus account, the Torah has conflated these two Exodus accounts into one. Now, if you read Manetho says there were two Exoduses. There was the Great Exodus, 1570 odd BC, and the Little Exodus of the 80,000 lepers and maimed priests. That happened during the Amarna dynasty. So that's the Little Exodus. Now, the Moses and Aaron would have been a part of the second smaller Exodus. And so in that case, Aaron and Moses was Pharaoh Akhenaten and his brother Moses. So the brother of Akhenaten was called Moses. And so these are the two brothers, Aaron and Moses, Akhenaten and Tuthmoses, Moses. They were both brothers. And so that's where we get this story of Moses coming into this, because we get this different story from Manetho that, again, Moses was the chief army commander of the Egyptian army. This is how important these people were. They weren't just slaves in Egypt. Somewhere here, I've got some other images. These are just AI images, but it just gives us a sort of a vague idea what we're talking about. So if I share this one up. So this would be Abraham talking to Pharaoh when he was talking about the sheep and the bulls, the great month of Aries and the great month of Taurus. Again, I've portrayed him as ginger because this was the ginger monarchy. We'll go into that later. Again, this is Abraham next to the pyramids. We can go into that later as well because there's a big secret there. So we've got this picture here. You have to ask yourself, because it's part of the same story. These people disappear off on their Exodus, and they go to Mount Sinai. How did they manage to lose Mount Sinai? How did the Israelites, who are inveterate chroniclers, they chronicle everything that's happened in their existence, how did the Israelites manage to lose Mount Sinai? Well, they didn't. They just don't want you to know what it is. So what is Mount Sinai? It's the largest mountain in the region. It's on the edge of a desert. It's the largest mountain, but it's small enough that you can put a fence around it because you weren't allowed to touch it. The penalty for touching Mount Sinai was death, so you didn't want to do that. It was steep and difficult to climb. It had a cave inside it where God lived. And at the bottom of it, there was a black pavement that looked like the night sky. So where is Mount Sinai? Well, you can see it here.
Yeah.
It's sitting behind Abraham. Mount Sinai was the Great Pyramid. So the Great Pyramid is on the edge of a desert. Mount Sinai was the largest mountain in the region. Great Pyramid is the largest pyramid in the region. It's small enough that you can cordon it off with a fence, put a fence around it because you weren't allowed to touch it. It's steep, it's difficult to climb. It did have a cave inside it, and that cave was always open. We know it was open because Strabo mentions it. He mentions the entrance into the Great Pyramid and how you could go down to the bottom of the Great Pyramid, into the cave at the bottom. The upper chambers were all concealed. Nobody knew about those. But the bottom chamber, the rough cavern at the bottom of the Great Pyramid, that was always open to deter robbers. Because what's the point of plundering a pyramid which has got its door open, you know? There's nothing there. You can go and have a look. So I think it was a method of stopping robbers getting into the pyramid. You just leave the door open and say, look, there's nothing here, chaps. And so, yes, there was a cavern inside it. And if you go to the eastern edge of the Great Pyramid, you'll see the black basalt pavement that looked like the night sky. So, yeah, in my estimation, Mount Sinai is the Great Pyramid because it was a mountain of the gods. What's the mountain of the gods in Egypt? Yeah, well, it's Mount Sinai, isn't it? These were not tombs, of course. We'll go into that later. None of these pyramids were tombs. They were mountains of the gods. They were dedicated to the stars and the cosmos, with alignments, pointing at, various points in the calendar year and so on. So, yeah, that's a little secret. And again, it ties the biblical story back into Egypt, that these people were thoroughly immersed in Egyptian culture. And so their famous mountain of the gods was Mount Sinai was the Great Pyramid. I'm clicking on the wrong bit. So this is Moses. I've put Osiris behind him. Osiris was the green man. If you go around modern churches and you find the green man in modern churches with all the foliage coming out of his face, that is Osiris. He was the green man, the god of vegetation. Here is Moses and the golden calf. A bit of a dramatic image. I'm sure it was nothing like this, but there we go. But he was the army commander. That's why I've dressed him in armor. It's probably not pertinent to this era, the armor. It's more Roman, I suppose, than anything else. But anyway, you get the idea. Moses was the chief army commander. According to Manetho and Josephus, he was the chief army commander of the Egyptian army. And it was Moses that went down to Nubia and defeated the Nubians, and took the Nubian queen as his wife. So this is Moses with his Nubian wife. Tharbis was her name. Tharbis. Well, She wasn't queen, she was the princess. And she was so taken by the beauty of Moses that she desperately wanted to marry him. So again, it's confirmed in the Torah, because Torah does say that Moses took a Nubian wife. But it doesn't give the whole story. This is why I prefer Josephus. Josephus gives the whole story of this battle, that the battle was in Meroe, which was the capital city of Nubia. And the princess that he took, which the Torah doesn't mention, the princess that he took as his wife was Princess Tharbis. You get much more information from Josephus than you do from the Torah story.
Yeah.
So that's just a little finishing flourish. And that was the second Exodus, as narrated by Manetho. That was the second Exodus, the small Exodus, which Manetho attaches to Moses more than the great Exodus, of course. But the biblical texts have conflated these two stories into one, and we just get the one Exodus in the biblical story.
I see.
There we go. That's the whole, pretty much, of the Genesis to Exodus story.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Like, I'm sure people are as enthralled with this as I am. Like, this whole story is, again, because these are ancient stories that you hear throughout sort of my childhood, schools, and sort of culture with it. But to be able to tie it towards historical sort of actual events that happened, things suddenly just come into sort of resolution there.
Because otherwise it's completely mythical. When I went through school education, Church of England and so on, they were trying to rationalize some of it, as they do in the Church of England, but it was still mostly mythical. And since you can't find these people in the historical record, it was probably a complete fantasy. It probably didn't happen. But now we can see, actually, it probably did happen. It's a real history with real people. It's just that these people were rather more powerful than we expect. They were real pharaohs instead of patriarchs. But that, to me, makes the story much more believable, much more interesting, that
Certainly.
This was a real history. I can actually show who these people were, what they were doing, what these events were all about, why these people were believing in all of this. And so it means that the Torah story becomes real history. It's a real textbook. Because as I said a long time ago, historians will dismiss the Torah. It's not history. They dismiss it. If they're looking for real history, they never refer back to the Torah. But if they had found this ancient scroll in a pot somewhere in Egypt that was 3,000 years old, and they dug it up and they started reading it, they wouldn't dismiss this story. They would read it as part of real history. And that's what the Torah is. It's this big scroll that has been found in a pot, except it's not been in a pot for a long time. We've had it in scrolls and books for ages. But it's a real story that has come out of Egypt. And I believe it is all verifiable, real history. If you are prepared to have the consequences of who these people really were, that they were really pharaohs of Egypt and not just patriarchs, shepherds, with a few starving sheep. A few starving sheep, yet you've got an army of 30,000 men. Yeah, that doesn't sort of equate. No, I think the real history is much more believable than the fantasy story they've tried to sell us.
Yeah.
And so the Torah story becomes real history, and we can use that in other points of history. If we're looking at the history of Egypt, now we should have a little bit of confidence that we can use the Torah story to find out what was going on in Egypt. And I've done that in various other portions of my work. So it's fascinating, and I'm very amazed that it's not been written about before. I mean, pretty much all of my work is unique in that it has not been mentioned before. People have brushed to one side of this story and brushed to the other side of the story, but nobody has attacked it head on and said, look, this is what this story actually means. So all of these books are completely unique. All of the ideas are unique. All of these ideas that we've just looked at are pretty much unique to my work. So they do make interesting reading for anyone that's interested in this story.
Yeah. And even into the next story that we'll be getting down the line with. I remember when I was younger, you come across the Gospels, you're reading them with it. And I remember looking up online, what else happened around the first century? And you hear that there was this Jewish revolt in Judea 40 years later. But, no, those two things can't be connected. We'll brush forward, And then eventually when I came across yours, it was just this, sort of illumination, this sort of penny drop where I was like, this is unbelievable. How is this not well known? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You sort of...
They've done exactly the same thing with the New Testament story. And if you read the New Testament, it's like all of these events happened in a vacuum. There's no mention of Rome and what Rome was doing, that Rome actually owned all of these lands and they were controlling them. It's like, a fantasy story just in the middle of nowhere. And nobody connects it back to real history. It's strange that people right through into the 21st century have not really connected these stories back into real history. They are still believing in these, fairy stories. I call them real history spread with fairy dust on top of them, because they won't admit what the real history actually is. And they are contentious in a way because we'll go into this more in the United Monarchy story, but it means, the real homeland of the Israelites is more in Egypt than it is in Judea, although they did control Judea later on, of course. But their true homeland for much of their existence was actually Egypt. And so that becomes contentious with the modern politics of that region. And that's another reason why a lot of people... Because I had these arguments with Finkelstein about the United Monarchy. And he was saying, well, it doesn't matter that all of the events are the same and all of the characters are the same. They still didn't come from Egypt. Well, you can see from his point of view why he might be saying that, because he will probably fall foul of the political regime if he starts saying that, the Israelite homeland is in Egypt.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult topic for a lot of people to actually discuss.
But we're here for the truth, you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it doesn't matter to me,
Yeah.
I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm just looking for the actual truth. Yeah, and the truth, I think, is more interesting than the story they've sold to us.
It is, isn't it? Truth stranger than fiction, isn't it?
Yeah,
very much.
It is indeed, yes.
So this has been brilliant. We've really laid the groundwork of that then to sort of start off and to maybe launch from, and maybe the next episode we'll get into this sort of exodus then of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, how then they sort of dispersed into other areas of sort of Europe and the start of Ireland and Scotland and all of these
and
kind
the
of
United
things.
Monarchy as well. We can do all that.
Yeah. Well, and if people want to learn a little bit more about your work, where's the best places to go to, Ralph?
Probably best to go on to Amazon. I'll give you all the links to the Amazon books. Try and get the latest editions, because there are some early editions out there. So I'll put the links to Amazon. They do the ebooks and they do the paperbacks, because that means I don't have to carry any stock anymore. It's all print on demand, which is a marvelous service. It works very well. The only problem with print on demand is it doesn't give color images. Whereas if you go for the ebooks, then they're all color images, which is good. So the primary thing is Amazon, and I'll drop the links, which you can put in the bottom there. I've got a YouTube channel. It's getting a little bit old now, but there's quite a few talks on my YouTube channel. Facebook, Ralph Ellis 144. Again, we'll drop the links in this video. That's fairly active, a lot of information on that. And my second X, well, because my first X account I was banned from X. I was kicked off. So I've started with a new one, and my new handle is at Ralph Ellis with a Y in the middle, because the original one was me, but it's been taken off, it's been banned, and that's quite active, and that's interesting. The Facebook and the X site is interesting because it's a lot of the additional material, which I have just dropped onto those sites and is not really part of a book. So what I've done with those extra material that has come out in the last, 6-8 years or whatever, I've put into 2 books called the Illumination series. So it's called Shards of Illumination, Book 1, Book 2, both 500 pages, so they're quite big. And they're just full of all of these pages from Facebook or X on generally new topics that I've not discussed before, plus summary of some of the other works in my books. But just sort of an easy read format, so you can just drop in. Each page is a separate story. You can drop into any page and read a separate story on each page. So that's interesting. It's done quite well. Shards of Illumination. So yeah, that's pretty much all of my contacts, I suppose.
Yeah, super. Well, thank you very much for all of your time today. I really, really appreciate it. I was looking forward to this for quite a while, and so I'm just very grateful for that. And thank you to everyone else for stopping by to watch. Stay tuned. I'm sure we'll have a lot more coming up on this topic then. And any last words, sort of, Ralph, at all, or should we wrap it up from there then? Yeah.
No, I think I think we've summed it up in the last 3 hours. Brilliant. It's just to reiterate, I've said this before, but it's all new material, so you won't find this in other books. Do enjoy and join in the discussions. There's lots of discussions going on on X and Facebook. So if anyone has any questions, I try to answer all questions.
Yeah, brilliant. Alrighty, well, thank you again. Thanks everyone else. We'll see you next time. Take care.
Yep. See you again.